Hello and welcome to my presentation on this new exciting tarot deck called the Evolutionary Tarot. This deck features 6 new major arcana cards, but in most respects it's like the classic Rider-Waite tarot deck. There have been some improvements done to several of the cards in order to make their imagery even more clear. You will also notice that there's a lot of racial, cultural, and sexual diversity portrayed in these cards in order to convey the truly universal character of the tarot. The 6 new major arcana cards are the result of over 20 years of research in which these cards have been used by myself in the application of tarot readings for countless people. The other thing that's different about these cards is that I have incorporated them into the major arcana based largely on numerology. Now I would like to take a few moments to explain to you how this deck came about. I've always been a student of the teachings of Carl Jung and the writings of Joseph Campbell. One concept in particular that really caught my attention that Carl Jung came up with was the concept of archetype. Now an archetype is a concept or an idea that's present almost universally in all cultures, although there may be different words for them, such as for the archetype of ruler. Any of these words might apply depending on the culture that you're in. So I started to look at the major arcana of the tarot and to ask which cards corresponded with the archetypes. There was a book that I was reading early on in my studies called The King, the Magician, the Warrior, and the Lover. And that was about the 4 key masculine archetypes. Now obviously, the archetype for ruler or king corresponds with the emperor. Then if you look at the other 3 archetypes, the magician obviously corresponds with the magician card. The warrior archetype I think shows up as the chariot card, and the lover's archetype obviously shows up as the lovers. So all of that began to make sense to me. But what about the feminine archetypes? I was aware of the 3 key feminine archetypes as written about by Starhawk and others as the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And when I looked at the tarot, it was easy to see that the maiden was represented by the high priestess, the mother was represented by the empress. But what about the crone energy? I didn't think there was any card that actually fit that. So I began to wonder, was it possible that some archetypes had either not been included in the tarot or had been lost or dropped over the years? So I began to do some investigating, and what I discovered that just like anything, the tarot has evolved. Take these 2 cards for example. The one on the left is the Marseille version of the Magician, while the one on the right is the classic Rider-Waite version. Now these cards have a very different feeling to them. The card in the Marseille deck looks almost like a trickster, whereas the card in the Rider-Waite, the Magician, is very focused and very clear in his intention. Now also consider the fact that in older decks, the Strength card was numbered as card number 11 and the Justice card was number 8, whereas in the Rider-Waite deck, we see just the opposite is true. The Strength is card number 8 and the Justice card is card number 11. There must have been a reason why this change had been incorporated into the new deck. So my intuition led me to do some meditation. I already had the crone energy that I decided to call the healer because I thought that made the card more clear. Then I had the teacher card. And finally I came up with the soul or essence card. Now this card is really important because I believe it gives people a sense of something other than their ego, so that when they're looking at their ego they can make change. And then eventually I came up with one more card which I called the Joker's Humor. But what do I do with these new cards? Where should I add them into the major arcana? This seemed to be a pretty significant question. Now I was aware of other decks that had added additional cards to the major arcana, But it just seemed to me like they were sort of added almost as an afterthought, and they were stuck at the end of the major arcana, and that just didn't make sense to me. I felt like these cards had to fit somewhere. So I started looking at Sally Nichols' work, The Jung and Tarot, which talks about the major arcana representing a process of development that occurs as you move from one card to the next. But I also thought about the fact that we use a different numbering system, and we use numbers, what we call base 10, which is numbers 0 and then 1 through 9. So I started to look at the numerology to see whether or not that might be the basis upon which I could add these new cards. I started to look at the major arcana cards and the meaning of those cards and the meaning of the numbers that were associated with those cards. And what I found was that there were many cards in the major arcana that did correspond to the numbers assigned to them, but some did not. So let's have a look at that to see how that pans out. Now, to do this, what it is necessary for us to do is to actually examine the meaning of numbers that are, as they are assigned in numerology. Now, some numbers have meanings associated with them that are obvious while others are not. For instance, the number 1, which is assigned to the magician, conveys the idea of the first, which a magician is the first card. And also with the number 1, we see words like wholeness and unity. And when we think about those words in relationship to the magician, we find that they work quite well. So then moving on to the high priestess, the number 2 has associated with it in numerology the concept of duality, polarity, pairing or opposition, cooperation, association, and partnership. So those words all actually seem to work pretty well with the high priestess. Some other characteristics of numerology that are not so obvious is also that number 2 relates to the intuitive and the feminine, and that certainly works very well with the high priestess. So moving on to the next card, which is the Empress. Now the number 3 in numerology relates to creativity, imagination, creative talent, and child within, as well as some of these other words. Now when you look at those words, they do seem to also correspond pretty well with the Empress card, because obviously she's pregnant, which would imply the child within, but it also has a meaning on a deeper level, which is the child within all of us that is creative. So this worked as well. Moving on to the next card, which is the Emperor, the meaning for the number 4 relates to construction, management, building, form, stability, boundaries, and organization. All of those words work really well with the Emperor. Some other words that numerology gives us about the number 4 is science and tradition, which actually also work with the Emperor and actually increase the depth of meaning that the Emperor offers us. So then we go to card number 5, which is traditionally called the Hierophant. And with this card, things begin to look a little different. The number 5 in numerology relates to freedom, change, curiosity, innovation, pioneering, and these other words. And all of those words don't really fit that well with the Hierophant. Now you could make an argument for the fact that maybe travel or administration or courage. But generally speaking, the meaning of the Hierophant and the meaning of the numerology for number 5 just don't fit. So is there another card that might actually work better as a 5 card? That was the question that I started to ask. And as it turns out, I felt there was a card that worked much better as a 5. And that card is the Chariot. The Chariot definitely has to do with pioneering, and he can relate to rebellion if he feels there's injustice, and he's definitely about expanding horizons, or he represents the principle of expanding our horizons. So that worked really well as a 5. Then I went to number 6, and the words associated with the numerology of 6 was love, harmony, healing. Now the Lover's card, or the Love card, would sort of work with the love characteristic of numerology of 6, but doesn't really fit that a love relationship always is about healing. There's some other words that might fit, but I began to look at that number, and this is the place where I felt the healer card worked much better. So I dropped this in as a number 6. So let's move on to card number 7. And the numerology characteristics of the number 7 have to do with analytical thinking, meditation, reflection, specialist, technician, research, scientist, and these other words. So let's look at what card we traditionally have as number 7, and that's the Chariot. And this just doesn't work as a 7, but we have a place for the Chariot. What works really nice as a number 7 is to drop the Hermit, because all of these characteristics relate to the way the Hermit card is read. Moving on to number 8. Now 8's a number of spiritual pragmatism, worldly affairs, management. Now traditionally the Strength card is number 8, and that again does not work all that well. But what does work as a number 8 is to put the Hierophant here as opposed to having it as a 5. So the last number we have to look at is number 9, and that will complete the first row of 9 cards and will cover all of the numerology for the numbers 1 through 9. Now the number 9 relates to universal service and divine standards. It also relates to theology. Now remember that theology is the study of the nature of God and religious belief rather than any specific religion. Now traditionally the number 9 card is the Hermit card, and that one might make some argument for him being a leader. What works much better as a 9 card is to drop my new card, the Teacher, into this location. I liked adding the Teacher card into the tarot because it represents experiences that teach us how to think rather than what to think. It takes us deeper into a new level of understanding. So now we have a card assigned to each of the primary numbers 1 through 9. For this theory to hold, we would also need to apply cards to numbers 1 through 9 in the second and in the third row of the major arcana, and there would need to be a consistency. For all the cards that are numbered number 1 or number 2, there needs to be a theme. But there's too much detail to explain here in this introductory video. You can find out about the additional details about the rows and also about the columns in my book, available through iBooks or in printed form. Thank you for your attention today.